October 14, 1943. Krakow, German-occupied Poland. The bread smelled perfect. That was the detail that haunted survivors for decades. Not the smoke, not the shattered stone, not the silence that followed. The bread. It smelled warm and golden and ordinary, the way bread in a bakery is supposed to smell, right up until the moment the ovens tore through the wall of the SS requisition house, and 15 men who had eaten at that table every morning ceased to exist. The Germans would spend 3 weeks searching for a partisan cell. They would interrogate dock workers, priests, school teachers. They would never once look at the woman who had baked their rolls. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. Her name was Marta Zelenska. She was 41 years old. She weighed 53 kilograms. Her hands were always dusted with flour, and she was the most dangerous person in occupied Krakow. The city of Krakow in the autumn of 1943 was a study in contradictions. It was beautiful impossibly, almost cruelly beautiful. The old town still gleamed with its medieval spires and limestone squares. The WWII castle rose above the Vistula River as it had for 6 centuries, golden in the late afternoon light, unchanged by bombs that had leveled Warsaw and scorched Warszawa's bones to rubble. Krakow had been spared destruction because the Germans wanted it intact. Hans Frank, the Nazi governor-general of occupied Poland, had installed himself in WWII Castle like a conqueror from another age, hosting dinners, hanging portraits, collecting what he called civilization, while the civilization outside his walls was quietly, methodically erased. And yet the city breathed. Covertly, desperately, defiantly, it breathed. Marta Zelenska had lived on Ulica Grodzka Street for 22 years. She had come there as a young bride, a girl from Noisech with flour-dusted hands even then, the daughter and granddaughter of bakers. Her husband, Tomasz, had owned the bakery at number 34, a narrow-fronted shop squeezed between a cobbler and a pharmacy, fragrant and warm in a way that drew people inside even when they had no money to spend. Hamas had been taken in the first round of mass arrests in September 1939, 4 days after the Germans marched through the city gates. He had been a schoolteacher as well as a baker, 2 crimes against the occupation's cultural cleansing programs. She had never seen him again. The Red Cross later confirmed Sachsenhausen. 1941. Their son, Piotr, was 19 when the war began. He had joined the Armia Krajowa, the home army, within weeks of the occupation. A slight, fierce young man with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness. He had lasted 2 years in the underground before a neighbor, perhaps frightened, perhaps rewarded, had said something to someone they should not have. Piotr was arrested in the spring of 1942 during the sweep of a printing operation on Kazimierz Street. He did not survive Montelubich prison. Marta was told about her son's death on a Tuesday morning in June, standing in her bakery, when a young woman she barely knew pressed a folded note into her hand along with payment for a loaf of rye bread. She unfolded it behind the counter, read the 3 words written there, and folded it behind the counter, read the 3 words written there, and folded it again. She finished her workday. She swept the floor. She cleaned the proving baskets and covered the sourdough starter and extinguished the lamps. Then she sat down in the dark and made herself a promise. She was not a soldier. She had never fired a rifle. She knew nothing of explosives, of dead drops, of coded messages or clandestine networks. What she knew was bread. She knew fermentation and combustion and the precise, dangerous relationship between enclosed heat and expanding gas. She knew flour dust, something every miller and baker understood intuitively was explosive under the right conditions. She knew her ovens, 2 large cast-iron beasts, each burning a wood and coal mixture, each capable of reaching temperatures that could reduce stone to powder forced beyond their design. And she knew that 15 SS officers ate breakfast rolls from her bakery every single morning, brought to the requisition house on Ulica Grodzka, 19 by a young Polish runner named WWII, a boy of 16 who had no idea he was ferrying them to their deaths and whose innocence Marta had worked very carefully to preserve. She knew something else too, something that most people standing outside 19 Grodzka Street did not know. The requisition house had once been a merchant's storehouse. Its interior walls were original medieval stone, nearly a meter thick in places, almost impenetrable. But the basement had been converted decades ago into a secondary kitchen, and the current German administrators, hungry for convenience, had installed a connecting passage between that basement kitchen and Marta's bakery next door at number 17, because it was faster to move bread that way than around the block. That passage, unguarded, unlocked, used twice daily, was the seam through which Marta Zelenska intended to thread her entire plan. She spent 6 months watching before she did anything at all. The watching itself was its own kind of resistance. Marta was already, by October 1942, a low-level courier for a fragment of Krakow's AK network, the Home Army's Urban Intelligence Cell, which operated under the cover name SOA, the Owl. She'd been recruited, carefully and indirectly, by a man she knew only as Pan Carroll, a retired pharmacist of approximately 60 years who came in every Thursday for a poppy seed roll and left with a small package of what appeared to be prescription medicine tucked under his arm. What the packages actually contained was information, troop movements, requisition schedules, the names of Polish informants who had been approached by the Gestapo. Marta's bakery sat at an ideal junction. German officers, Polish civilians, delivery men, and black market traders all moved through or near it. She learned to listen without appearing to listen. She learned that the German language, spoken quickly and with assumed invisibility by men who believed the Poles around them understood nothing, contained extraordinary intelligence. She began passing on what she heard, but she also began planning something beyond courier work. She was methodical about it in the way bakers are methodical, precise, patient, attentive to variables that others would dismiss. She studied the morning routine at number 19 with the thoroughness of a military engineer. The 15 SS officers who occupied the requisition house were not a random collection of bureaucrats. They were, Marta had gathered from overheard conversations and careful cross-referencing with Pan Carroll's information, a logistics coordination unit responsible for managing deportation transport schedules across the Kraków district. They were not frontline soldiers. They were administrators of atrocity, men who sat at tables with maps and timetables and made decisions about which trains went where and how many people could be loaded into each car. They arrived at number 19 in October 1942, and they ate their breakfast rolls at 7:30 in the morning, every morning, without exception. The rolls arrived via Dawid at 7:15. They were consumed with ersatz coffee and, on Fridays, with a small portion of butter that had been requisitioned from a dairy farm in Wieliczka. Marta baked them herself. She never once considered poisoning them, not because she was squeamish about their deaths, but because poison was uncertain, detectable, and forensically traceable. What she wanted was something that looked like an accident, something that sent a message without a signature. In the spring of 1943, she made her first move. She began, gradually, almost imperceptibly, running her ovens hotter, not dramatically hotter, nothing that would scorch bread or alarm a German inspection, 3 degrees above normal, then 5. She kept detailed mental notes on combustion behavior, on the way the stone flue connecting her bakery to the basement kitchen radiated heat, on the precise spots where mortar had been worn thin by decades of thermal cycling. She was, in effect, conducting a months-long structural survey of 2 adjacent buildings using nothing but her hands and her professional knowledge of fire. She also began cultivating the young SS logistics officer, Unterscharführer Werner Holtz, who occasionally came in person to collect the breakfast order when Dawid was unavailable. Holtz was 26, homesick, and visibly uncomfortable in his role. He spoke enough Polish to be polite. He sometimes lingered at the counter and talked about his mother's bakery in Regensburg. Marta listened. She smiled. She gave him, once, a small saffron roll for free, which he ate at the counter with a look of such uncomplicated happiness that she had to concentrate to keep her expression warm. She learned from Holtz slowly, through careful conversation, that the officers met every weekday morning in the basement kitchen at 7:30, not in the main dining hall, in the basement, below street level, enclosed. She also learned, in August 1943, that a senior Gestapo official named Obersturmbannführer Friedrich Roche was scheduled to arrive in Krakow in mid-October for a 3-day coordination meeting. All 15 logistics officers would be present for the morning briefing on October 14th. All of them would be in the basement kitchen at precisely 7:30 a.m. It would never happen again. Not all 15. Not in that room. Marta went to Pan Carroll. She told him everything. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." What Marta needed was small. That was the genius of it, and also the terror, the smallness. She did not need weapons. She did not need a bomb, a rifle, a truckload of explosives smuggled through checkpoints. She needed two specific items, both of them available within Krakow's black market with the right connections which Pan Carroll, it turned out, possessed. The first was a quantity of magnesium powder, approximately 2 kilograms, fine-milled, sealed in waxed paper packets of the type used to store baking ingredients. Magnesium powder, when introduced into a coal-burning oven already running at high temperature, does not explode immediately. It burns ferociously, almost unnaturally bright, and its combustion produces heat intense enough to cause secondary ignition of surrounding material. In an enclosed space, connected by a flue to a second enclosed space packed with dry wood, seasoned coal, and the accumulated residue of 20 years of bread baking, the chain reaction would be swift and total. The second item was a mechanical delay trigger, a small clock mechanism, the kind used in older alarm clocks, repurposed and fitted with a simple contact igniter. A man named Benedict, whom Marta met only once in the back room of a Kazimierz watchmaker's shop, built it for her in 4 days. He did not ask what it was for. His hands shook slightly as he handed it over, and she understood that he knew anyway. She spent 10 days practicing, not with the real components, that would have been suicidal, but she had an identical clock mechanism, salvaged from her own kitchen, and she practiced the motions of setting it, of threading wire through a narrow gap, of working in total darkness with her eyes closed, because she knew she would have only a matter of minutes in the basement kitchen, and she could not afford a single hesitation. She also spent those 10 days eating almost nothing, not from grief or from fear, though both were present. She ate minimally because she needed to be as physically small as possible. The connecting passage between the two buildings, the medieval merchant's tunnel, was 60 centimeters wide at its narrowest point. Marta Zelenska was not a large woman, but 60 centimeters requires commitment. On the evening of October 13th, she baked. This was the cover and the ritual both. She baked through the night, filling the bakery with warmth and smell, producing the full morning order and more: rolls, rye loaves, a small batch of sweet buns that she had no particular plan for. She worked as she had worked for 22 years, hands certain in the familiar motions, mind elsewhere and everywhere, running and rerunning the sequence, the timings, the single point of failure she could not fully control, which was the flue. At 4:15 a.m., when the street outside was empty and the German patrol had passed on its predictable schedule 20 minutes earlier, Marta opened the connecting passage. She had been through it before, twice, during daylight hours, under the pretense of forgotten equipment. The Germans at number 19 had never questioned it. Now she moved through it with a cloth wrapped around her forearms and a small canvas bag slung across her back. No lamp. She had memorized the passage by touch. The basement kitchen of number 19 was cool and dark. Stone floor, stone ceiling, the smell of old grease and ersatz coffee. The oven, a large iron dual-chamber industrial type installed by the Germans to replace the original medieval hearth, sat against the north wall, its flue running upward and connecting, via the original chimney architecture, to the same main stack that served Marta's ovens next door. She had approximately 20 minutes before the first signs of pre-dawn movement from the upper floors. She moved to the oven. She had studied its design from a distance and from Holtz's offhand descriptions. She knew which chamber burned coal, which burned wood, which damper controlled airflow to the upper stack. She placed the magnesium packets first, not inside the firebox. That would be noticed during morning lighting. She placed them in the secondary ash collection chamber beneath the firebox, a space that would not be checked before ignition, arranged around the mechanical trigger with its contact wire threaded through to the fuel grate above. When the morning fire was lit, at approximately 7 a.m., before the officers came down, the heat descending through the grate would reach the trigger within 15 to 20 minutes. At 7:15 to 7:20 minutes, that 15 to 7:20. The officers would arrive at 7:30. She set the trigger. She had rehearsed this so many times in darkness that her hands barely trembled. Barely. She crawled back through the passage. She was at her counter by 4:50 a.m., dusting flour from her forearms. Her bread was cooling on the racks. The rolls for number 19 were wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, ready for Dawood's 7:15 collection. She sat down. She did not pray. She was not certain any more what she believed in. She thought of Tomasz. She thought of Piotr. She thought of the map she had seen once, in Pan Karol's back room, showing the railway lines that ran from Kraków Główny Station southeast toward Belhany and Sobibor, lines that the men in that basement kitchen managed and maintained and kept running on schedule. She thought about the bread. At 6:45 a.m., Dodd arrived. He was a bright boy, a little nervous in the way that 16-year-olds who understood the occupation were always a little nervous. He collected the rolls without comment. Marta handed him a poppy seed pastry that she hadn't planned to make and told him to eat it on the way. He smiled and went out the door, and she watched through the window as he turned right toward number 19, and she thought, he will be on the street when it happens. He will be safe. She had timed everything for that, too. At 7:09 a.m., Marta locked her bakery and walked east toward the Planty Gardens. She walked at a normal pace, the pace of a woman going to market, not hurrying, not looking back. The October morning was cold and gray, the Planty's trees stripped of leaves, the paths dusted with the first light frost of autumn. She did not hear the explosion. She was 300 meters away, and the medieval stone absorbed a great deal. What she heard was more like a concussion of air, a deep, physical pressure that moved through her chest rather than through her ears, followed by a rumbling she felt in her feet through the cobblestones, followed by shouts. She kept walking. She did not turn around. She reached the bench near the barbican, where Pan Karol sat every morning with a newspaper he never actually read, and she sat down beside him, and neither of them said anything at all. Later she would learn the details, piece by piece, over the following weeks, through the careful intelligence network that Pan Karol's SOA cell maintained. The fire in the basement kitchen of number 19 Grodzka Street had ignited at 7:18 a.m., triggered by the magnesium compound reaching combustion temperature when the morning fire was stoked. The chain reaction had moved faster than Marta had calculated. The old stone flue was drier than she had anticipated, and the secondary ignition had been nearly simultaneous rather than sequential. The explosion, technically a rapid overpressure event caused by the combined combustion of magnesium, wood, coal dust, and the accumulated grease of the kitchen environment, had collapsed the basement kitchen ceiling, which was also the ground floor of the main hall above. Obersturmbannführer for Rausch had not yet arrived. He was still at the train station. The 15 logistics officers had been at table. There were no survivors from the basement. 3 German soldiers on the street outside suffered minor injuries from flying stone and blasts. The Weed, who had delivered the rolls and left 12 minutes earlier, was unhurt and had no knowledge of what he'd carried. The German investigators spent their first week looking for a bomb. They found no trace of one because there was none. The final official report, buried deep in Hans Frank's administrative archive and not discovered until 1962, attributed the incident to structural failure of the medieval foundation exacerbated by improper installation of the heating system. It was listed as an accident. The Germans came to her bakery 2 days later. She had expected them. She had prepared for them in the same way she had prepared for everything, methodically, practically, with the understanding that panic was a form of noise that accomplished nothing. 2 Gestapo men and a Wehrmacht officer. They were looking for information about the incident, they said. Had she heard anything? Had she noticed anything unusual in the past weeks? Had anyone unfamiliar come to the shop? Marta offered them coffee, real coffee, from a small reserve she kept for exactly this kind of emergency, and told them she had heard a terrible sound on the morning of the 14th, that she had assumed it was a gas main, that she had been very frightened. She expressed with entirely genuine feeling that it was a tragedy. She was, after all, Austrian by heritage, she said, a small lie, almost reflexive, and she had always found the German officers to be respectful customers. The Gestapo men drank their coffee. They noted her name and address. They left. She did not breathe properly for approximately 3 hours afterward. The weeks that followed were the strangest of the war for Marta Zelenska. She continued baking. She continued passing intelligence to Pan Karol. She listened to the conversations of new German officers who came through, because, of course, a replacement logistics unit arrived within a fortnight, because the deportation schedules did not pause for dead administrators, because the machinery of occupation was designed precisely so that no single person was irreplaceable. That was the thing that hollowed her out, in the end, not the act itself. She had made her peace with the act, perhaps even before she committed it, in the way that the truly determined sometimes do. What wore at her was the continuity. The trains continued running. New men sat at new tables and made new schedules. The war was enormous, and her act within it was small, and she knew this, and she kept baking. But she also knew what Pan Carroll had told her, quietly, in the Planty Gardens a week after the explosion, that the Sola cell had received confirmation from a contact at Kraków Gujuni station that 3 deportation convoys scheduled for late October had been delayed by a minimum of 3 weeks due to the disruption of the logistics coordination unit. 3 weeks during which the partisans operating in the surrounding countryside had managed to interfere with 2 separate rail segments. Weeks in which certain people had been warned, had moved, had disappeared from lists. She held that number, 3 weeks, and kept it. The cold came hard in November. The bakery was harder to heat, and she was rationed on coal like everyone else, and the bread she produced was coarser now, darker, made with whatever grain she could source. Still, she baked. She was known in the neighborhood as a woman you could trust, not because people knew what she had done, but because she was consistent, and consistency in occupied Krakow was its own form of courage. Pan Carroll was arrested in December. She did not know the details, and in this work, you learn not to ask for them. He was replaced in the network by a young woman named Irena, who had studied chemistry before the university was closed, and who operated with the same Thursday poppy seed roll protocol. And Marta did not mourn the transition, at least not outwardly, because mourning was a luxury she had learned to defer. She thought about Werner Holtz sometimes. He had not been in the building on October 14th. He had been recalled to Berlin in late September, which was a thing she had not known, and which she would never know whether it troubled her or relieved her. He had been kind, in his way, in the particular tragic way of someone doing terrible work, with a polite face, and she understood that this did not exonerate him, and also that it complicated the simplicity of her hatred in ways she found useful to acknowledge and then set aside. The winter of 1944 to 1944 was long. She was not heroic in it. She was tired. She had headaches. She baked bread and moved information and tried not to think too often about Tomasz or Pyotr. She allowed herself on Sunday mornings to sit by the window with a cup of weak tea and watch the light move across the limestone facades of the old town and remind herself that beauty persisted, that this was something, that the city surviving was a form of resistance too. She was 42 years old, and she had done something extraordinary, and she carried it with her the way she carried all the irreversible things, quietly and without the expectation that anyone would notice. The Red Army entered Krakow on January 18, 1945. The Germans, retreating too fast and too chaotically to implement their planned demolitions, left the old town intact. Krakow was survived the war more complete than almost any other city in occupied Poland. Its streets, its churches, its medieval bones preserved in a way that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who had watched Warsaw burn. Marta Zelenska watched the Soviet soldiers come up Grodska Street from her bakery window. She did not go out to cheer. She was not sure what she felt. Liberation was the word people used, and it was true in the specific sense that the German occupation had ended, and it was also not entirely true in the sense that the city was now occupied by a different kind of power whose nature was still becoming clear. She kept baking. In 1947, a researcher from the newly formed Polish Ministry of Culture's Historical Documentation Office came to interview her as part of a broader investigation into wartime resistance activities in the Krakow district. He was young, serious, clearly uncomfortable. He had a list of names and incidents, and he was working through them methodically. He mentioned the incident at number 19 Grodska Street. He described it as it had been officially listed, an accident, a heating malfunction. Marta poured him tea. She listened carefully to his description of the incident. She said she remembered the morning very well. It had been very frightening. She was glad no Polish civilians had been hurt. She did not tell him anything else. He thanked her and left, and she washed his cup and went back to work. She kept the secret for 31 years. In 1974, at 72 years old and in declining health, she dictated a testimony to her nephew, who would become a journalist in Warsaw. She asked him not to publish it until after her death. He honored that request. She died in 1976 of a cardiac event, peacefully in the flat above the bakery she had operated for 53 years. The nephew, Andrzej Zelenska, published the testimony in 1978 in a small Warsaw historical journal. It was translated into German in 1983, partially through the efforts of a German historian named Klaus Hartmann, who had been investigating Hans Frank's administrative records and who had, in the course of that research, found the buried 1943 report attributing the Grodska Street incident to structural failure. He had never been satisfied with that explanation. The testimony confirmed his suspicion. The story received wider attention in Poland during the political and cultural openings of the 1980s. It was included in a 1989 anthology of wartime resistance accounts published by the Historical Institute in Warsaw. A small memorial plaque was installed on the facade of what had been number 17 Grodska Street in 1991, the year Poland held its first fully free elections. The plaque is modest, easy to miss. It gives Marta's name and dates, and a single line, W.T.H. Piekarni, Odwaga Majala, Mia Smak Kelba. In this bakery, courage tasted like bread. The building at number 19 Grodska Street still stands. The basement, rebuilt in the 1950s, is now used for storage by a restaurant. Nobody who eats there knows what the stones beneath their feet remember. What do we make of Marta Zelenska? She was not a soldier. She received no military training, held no rank, fired no weapon. She was a widow and a baker and a grieving mother who possessed a precise and practical understanding of heat, and who used that understanding with extraordinary patience and exactitude against men who administered one of the most efficient killing operations in human history. She never described herself as brave. In the testimony dictated to her nephew, she said only that she had done what was possible and that she was not certain it had been enough, and that she had kept baking because it was the thing she knew how to do and because people needed bread. The trains kept running, she said. She knew that. She had never pretended otherwise, but she had also learned in the years after the war about some of the people who had survived the delayed deportations of October 1943, a family in Kraków, a man who had been on a list and was warned in time to disappear into the countryside. She did not know their names. She had not tried to find them. It was enough, she wrote, to know that they existed, that somewhere in the continuation of the world there were people who were alive who might not have been. That was what she had been baking for. There is a particular kind of heroism that does not announce itself. It does not wear a uniform or leave a monument or produce a story that others immediately recognize as extraordinary. It operates in the register of the ordinary, in flour and yeast and fire, in patience and precision and the long discipline of grief transformed into action. It does not ask to be remembered. It does what it can with what it has, and then it makes tea and washes the cup and goes back to work. Marta Zelenska baked bread for 53 years in a city that survived. History doesn't always know which things it owes her, but the stones on Grodska Street remember, and now so do you.